Hello, I'm Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabid Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. You are free to like or dislike the video, so please feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You also feel free to share my videos to anyone you like. Not really all that possessive. Just me on my soapbox. Um, just a little note, I am experiencing a little bit of a cough, so if I end up coughing a little bit, that's kind of where that's coming from. I do want to thank all the 8 subscribers to the channel. I did grow one more since I think last time. We're now at week 4, which means I'm actually finishing, I think, up my first month of YouTubing. And so far, it's been a pleasant experience. I have 24 watched hours so far, and those are the 2 things that are significant for monetization. So, I got 992 more followers to get, and I think it's 4,000 hours. So, 24 hours, you do the math. I've got a lot of view hours to watch. That's why I keep making content. Hopefully, people come, like what I do, and start binge watching a little bit, and that brings up the hours. So thank you for that. A little bit of personal information. I think I did mention that, I might be a little bit busier. That's because I got a promotion where I work. So I'm now working, instead of working 3/4 time, I'll be working full time. It comes with a nice raise and some more hours. So I'm happy for that. It's not the ultimate end game or the end goal for me, but it's nice to be appreciated. I want to thank everybody that batted for me at work. It was nice to hear that, and thank you very much. On Fridays I tend to adjust comments, and so far this week I've only really received 2 that I think deserve some commentary, either on Facebook or wherever. One person was responding to my Challenge to Christians video, which I'll link above. And she was like, I think I responded to her last week, but she's like, I hear what you're saying, have you ever heard of Origen's First Principles? Now, I have not read the Fathers of the Christian Church probably since seminary. And I read them back then because I was working on my master's thesis, which is about First Timothy, and I was looking for how the founding fathers used First Timothy to bolster whatever case they were making about the church. And Origen didn't really help me all that much. But when I was Googling First Principles and Origen, I didn't get Origen at first. What I got was Aristotle. And I don't know where this commenter is driving at yet, but if I was going to look at Origen as a way to prove the faith, what you are basically saying is something about, what is the most basic first principles. Now, Origen doesn't, I haven't had a chance to reread Origen's First Principles, but I may do so. But when I was looking at the video and reading some of the material on Aristotelian First Principles, the idea of First Principles is that which provides support for a concept but can't be broken down any further. If I was an apologist, I would probably use the idea of first principles as God being one of those first principles, that you can't break that down any further. I would, however, now probably argue against that, because as a former theologian, I can see that God is broken down. So God really isn't a first principle because he can be categorized, he can be separated, and he can be broken down in the human mind. We can talk about his attributes, we can talk about his qualities, we can talk about his actions. You can start dividing that even further. You can talk about omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence. You can start breaking down God. If you're a Trinitarian, you can talk about, that which involves the Father, that which involves the Son, that which involves the Holy Spirit. If you're a Catholic, you can throw in Mary in there too. The point is that you can't really break down God as a first principle because he can be further broken down into other principles. And because of that, I don't really think that God serves the purpose of a first principle. at least not in the Aristotelian sense. Now, whether Origen brings something into that discussion, I don't know, but I'll get to that later as I look into it. Another comment came from an old friend of mine, Mike Spears. I'm glad to have you with me, Mike. Thanks. He leaves this comment: an issue I have had with the Bible, and maybe you are planning on addressing this in another video, that the Christian religion believes that we all came from Adam and Eve and then the flood, so all people would have come from Noah's family. Then how could there have been a chosen people if they all came from the same origin? Well, in theological circles, and when we talk about who God picks, it really comes down to this idea of election. Theologically speaking, election is this idea that certain people are picked by God to represent him and be his chosen people, and others are not. In the case of the Israelites, yes, Noah survives, and then if you look at the lineage, you follow certain lineages until you get to Abraham, and then at that point that Abraham is chosen by God and his family is chosen by God to be God's chosen people. When you get to the New Testament, it kind of shifts, because New Testament theologians will talk about election in terms of whether or not it's God's fiat power that makes people elect, whether it's his foreknowledge, or in the case, I eventually left both those ideas behind. The first of divine power is generally represented by Calvinistic election, which is unconditional election, where God just predetermines before anybody is born who is going to get saved and who is going to die, and there's nothing you die in hell, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're basically elected one way or the other, and there's really nothing you can do or change about it. Your whole life goes forward as you being nothing more than a mechanization of God Almighty, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. What would be the purpose of that? If the God already knows what's going to happen, why would you make it in the first place? Because that becomes the other problem. The Arminian school, believes that God elects by foreknowledge. And so God just randomly, he doesn't just randomly come up to people. People are presented faith. They're given what's called prevenient grace, which allows them to truly and genuinely accept salvation or not. And then there's the camp I fell into at the end of my faith, which was the open theist camp, where we say it is elected based on the formation of a relationship that is free will on both sides between God and the person. An election is simply, if you are part of the church, then you are elected to salvation, but whether you're not, you're part of the church is your choice. And so that becomes more of a free will idea of, God electing the church or electing his chosen people, which kind of comes back to the idea of God electing Israel or the family of Jacob. Now, this is where it gets complicated and where it gets convoluted. Because what this leads to is this idea of elitism, that somehow as part of God's chosen people, whether you're Jewish in the Old Testament or whether you're Christian in the New, you're the one that has the knowledge of salvation. You're the one you're saved and other people aren't. You're going to heaven and other people are going to hell. No matter how hard you shake or dance, a few drops are going to go into your pants here. What's going to happen is that you end up creating a foundational philosophy that says, I'm better than everybody else. Now, I can already hear the hue and cry. We're not saying we're better than everybody else. I remember the quote I used to use, the difference between me and an unsaved person is I'm a beggar who knows where to find bread. It's still saying that I know something that somebody else doesn't, and therefore I am better because I know how to find bread and he doesn't. No matter how you slice this, and this is true in a lot of religions, I'm not just picking on Christianity, but there is this notion that you have some sort of special knowledge or special condition or special relationship with God or the divine that makes you better than everybody else that doesn't have those things. And those people are lost, or they're not walking in the truth, or they're not quite there all the way. And this notion goes throughout all the Christian scriptures. It goes throughout all the Old Testament scriptures. Other religions have this as well, where you have this notion that you've arrived and everybody else has not. And no matter how you slice that idea, you're going to be walking in a little bit of pride. There's not a lot of humility to a notion that I'm elected by God, that and other people aren't. That puts you in a special category where you are better than they are because you're elected and they're not. Oh, it doesn't really mean I'm better. Well, you're going to heaven and they're going to hell. I would say that that's a pretty significant difference. And that somehow you have found this truth and nobody else has, that's also a pretty arrogant statement. When people ask me what I think the motivation behind saying that you're God's chosen people is, well, I think it's pride or there's some other motive. In the case of the Israelites, I believe, based on my own scholarship of the Bible, and there's a lot of things that I could say about that, but in recent years, as I've studied it, I believe, and this is my theory of how the Old Testament came into being. I think there may very well have been a kingdom of Israel and Judah. There's some evidence for that, and a few other of the kings that are mentioned in the Kings and Chronicles are there. It's sketchy, but they're there. Okay. Well, those people went into exile. First the Assyrians scattered the northern kingdom of Israel, then the Babylonians come along and take the kingdom of Judah captive, probably along with some of the Israelites from before, and then they all end up in exile inside the Babylonian kingdom. Well, then the Babylons fall to the Persians, the Medes and the Persians. And the Medes and the Persians decide to send everybody back to their homeland. Now, I'm guessing, and this is a guess, although maybe some other biblical scholar, if they see this video, can enlighten me a little bit, leave me a comment. I'm guessing that probably the Persian king, when he's making this decision, when Cyrus is making this decision of who is going to go back to what land, he's got to figure out who owns that land and who's going to control it. And some of the reasons that have to be given, maybe there's a distinctive culture, they have their own religion, they have some sort of divine or otherwise claim to that land based on history and tradition. And so if the Israelites are at first copying the Torah and doing other things in order to maintain their culture and traditions in the face of exile, now a lot of that stuff can come together and say, hey, we can go back to the beginning where God promised, the God of heaven and all there is, has promised to Abraham that this land will belong to him and his descendants, and we are all his descendants. We have a system of law, we have a culture, we have, a way of doing things, we have, these various tribes, and they can make a good case to the king of Persia that they have a right to this land and that they're going to rule it well. And then the king of Persia sends them on their way, and they continue to form, the books of the Old Testament Bible as a way of preserving this culture that they have created. I believe that Genesis through Deuteronomy is kind of their mythology, and then Joshua and Judges might be their legends, but you don't really get anything real till probably the Kings or Chronicles, and the more farther away back it goes. I really have a feeling that most of the Old Testament was written, somewhere between 800 BC and forward to maybe 200. People ask me about things like revealed prophecies. It says, except the prophecies all seem to have a tendency to be written well after the fact of their fulfillment. It gets really easy to write a text that fulfills prophecy if you're writing about after the prophecy was made and the fulfillment of it that seemed to work. Well, now you can just connect the dots or make up a prophecy that fits what happened. And I think that's what a lot of happened in the Old Testament. That's going a long way to simply saying if you spend all this time creating this culture, creating this belief that you're God's chosen people, you may have had the motive to get your land back, but that's going to insist in you, it's going to seat in you this kind of spiritual pride. And that spiritual pride begins to say, we are God's people, everybody else is not. Everybody else is not God's chosen people. And it creates this initial tribalistic dichotomy between those who are chosen by God and those who are not. This idea has probably been the most harmful thing that religion does, because religion, then, no matter what it is, puts us at odds with every other religion and every other belief system. If you don't believe as I believe, I have the right to destroy you because you are a lesser person because you don't believe as I believe. It's like George Carlin says, do you believe in God? No, dead. Do you believe in God? Yes. Well, do you believe in my God? No, dead. This is the basis, this pride, this arrogance that you are part of God's chosen people that has led to a lot of misery in the world. As an atheist, I don't have that view at all. I don't feel I'm any more special or less special than anybody else. We're all human beings on this planet. We're all trying to do the best we can. We're all trying to live long lives and in prosperity, as whatever we want to define prosperity as. And I don't have this notion that I'm better than anybody else or different than anybody else. I've had to readjust my views. A Christian cannot give that up, because either he's a Calvinist that believes that God specifically picked him before time began to be saved, and everybody else that isn't picked is elected damnation, which, if they're going to die in hell anyway, what difference does it make if you kill them or rob or rape them now? It doesn't matter. Or if you believe it's by foreknowledge, well, God knows what I'm going to do and knows where they're going to be and knows who's going to heaven and knows who's not going to heaven, absolutely, then, what difference is it? Same thing. I can kill, rob, or rape the people that are unelected to salvation and never will be elected to salvation with impunity. Even as an open theist, I could sit there and say, yeah, I'm special because I chose God and God chose me. And you could really puncture that relationship to a whole new height of arrogance. When I talk about, the chosen people problem inside of faith, this is what I'm talking about. Because when you start to believe that you're chosen, when you start to believe that you're elect and everybody else might not be, that puts you in a pretty arrogant position when it comes to everybody else, because you're basically saying you're a better human being because either God elected you, you had enough sense to realize that God, through his foreknowledge, elected you, or you'd chosen that relationship. In Christian circles, I saw this kind of arrogance translate into a lot of things. I think most notably is Christian nationalism, this idea that the United States should be a Christian nation. I saw it when I studied historically, the idea of manifest destiny, of stretching west. Even though there's other peoples there, it doesn't matter. They're not really people because they're not Christians like us, and they're not elected to salvation like us. So therefore, we can get rid of them. You see this all the time in some of the most bloody wars of history, where somebody says, we are the chosen people of God, and these other people are not the chosen people of God. So therefore, we have the right to kill them, because, God's not going to accept them anyway, and they're never going to turn around, so we might as well kill them and save God the trouble. This attitude is what comes out of that chosen people. If I were to take the biblical story account as gospel, which I don't, I think when I look at the Noah story, the immediate genetic problem that everybody will talk about is the genetic bottleneck. You literally have one man and three of his sons as children. That's a very limited genetic pool right there. The only thing that unlimits the pool is where the wives of all these guys came from, but there's no evidence that Noah's wife had more children, as far as I know. It was all his three sons that had children. So that kind of leads us to a real bad genetic bottleneck of how that would work. Of course, the Christians always try to get by it. Well, that's God of the gaps. Or they say, well, maybe the genetic code was better back then. That's a pretty far-fetched argument. Can you trace that down and show that it was better? I mean, with modern genetic techniques, you should be able to do that. It's only 6,000 years ago or less. You should be able to trace the genetics and see that it was less complicated or less prone to error back then. You should be able to do that. But that's not what you see. In fact, I now consider the genetic code so messy, it's poor design. It's what happens when you have a bunch of chemicals trying to react to the environment, and this is what happens to have them do that. Um, People don't like that, but that's kind of the way I see it. What I'm trying to say is this: I don't have any reason to be prideful. Evolution doesn't have its aim some sort of supermen or superwomen. Yeah, evolution doesn't really have an aim. Evolution is simply variation in kind over time. Well, variation in species. I need to. I'm sorry about that for those of you that are more evolutionary in tune. I'm still purging my language of terms that no longer apply, which is another part of the deconversion process, which is kind of the last thing I want to talk about. I absolutely feel for people that are deconverting. I get it. I get that sometimes it's videos like this one where I ask very basic, simple questions and people go, I never really thought of it that way. And they go back and think about it and, maybe the guy's got a point, or maybe this person has a point, maybe she has a point. And what I want you to understand is that deconverting is very difficult. I spent 40 years as a Christian. I still find myself using Christianese, which is the language that Christians use between each other from time to time. I still find myself thinking in terms as if there's an afterlife for me to fear or dread. Um, you know, it's that fear that you might be wrong and you might go to hell. But that kind of goes to the last part. Why is it then that I, as an atheist, wouldn't make that wager? Well, it goes back to this idea of God's chosen people and why that is problematic. Pascal's wager says, why wouldn't you just simply believe in God? Because if you're right, then you have everything to gain and everything to lose. But if you're an atheist, if atheism turns out to be right, you really don't lose anything and you don't really gain anything. Well, it's not quite as simple as that. I would say atheists gain intellectual integrity and honesty, which is something that should be gained. I think the virtue of truth is present in that, which is far more beneficial than lies. So being honest, I think, has its own rewards. But there's another problem. Which God am I supposed to believe in? Which one is actually the one that produces me as a chosen person that will be elected to salvation? It's not just even a question of that. Would not a supreme being know that I'm just believing in him because I don't want to go to hell, that I'm just trying not to get my coat singed? It seems that such a God would take into account my motivation for wanting to know him and follow him. And, if I have my doubts, how is that going to work for me? But it's not, it goes even further than that. What if the Muslims are right and the Christians are wrong? Then Pascal's wager isn't this false dichotomy between two choices. It's this: we have atheism over here, we have agnosticism, and then we have a plethora of choices that you can lay your chips on and roll the roulette wheel. It gets really worse because now you're saying, okay, which chosen people am I going to become a part of in order to escape whatever damnation that religion has and gain whatever salvation that religion has? Pascal's wager fails not only because God would know, a supreme being would know, but also which supreme being are we talking about here and on what basis? It's not as simple as, you're going to believe in God and therefore you'll be saved. And so, even if it turns out to be untrue, you don't lose anything. I could lose even worse by believing in the wrong God. And that is just as much a problem. This is why this is all ridiculous. Okay, I'm going to use that word a lot, I suppose. Ridiculous. It's ridiculous to believe in God because which God are we talking about? Becomes a real obvious answer. Which chosen people do I become part of so that I'm chosen and not damned? And this is something that people who believe in faith don't really want to talk about because they just want to throw out Pascal's wager there and say, oh, you believe in God, you gain everything and you don't lose anything. If you don't believe in God, you have the potential of not really gaining much but losing everything. Why wouldn't you take that wager? Because I might answer the God question, do you believe in God? Yes. Well, do you believe in my God? No, wrong. And that's the real issue. You know, it's not just a simple black and white decision. That wager is more of a roulette wheel, okay, where you're basically laying your chip, your single chip of your eternal life destiny on one space, and we're spinning the wheel and hoping that your number comes up. That's ridiculous. Those odds I don't want to face. I would rather just live my life as virtuously as I can. And if the gods of this world are good, they do exist, then they will judge me by that. If they're malevolent, I don't want to serve them anyway. I'd rather shake my fist from the pit of hell at a malevolent God, which means if the God of the Old and New Testament turns out to be true, yeah, I'd rather prefer that option. Because I think that the God of the Old and New Testament, the more I look at him, is an evil son of a bitch. Sorry, I do. He condones genocide, he condones slavery. His best plan to coming up for redeeming people from sin is to torture and murder his own son as a sacrifice from himself to save us from himself. There's no logic or reason to such a concept. And it bothered me for years, but you keep preaching it because that's what you do. Okay. I mean, the God of the Bible is one of the most despicable characters in fiction I know, quite frankly. You know, and that's something that this channel will constantly going out. And one of the most despicable concepts, regardless of which type of theology you use, in my opinion, is this idea that suddenly you're a chosen person and therefore you get to treat yourself differently than you treat others that are not chosen. It's a bad concept. It's a lousy concept, and I prefer the atheism idea of equality, that it doesn't matter what sex you are, sexual orientation you are, what race you are, where you come from, what culture you are. We all stand as equal human beings, period. I further believe that if you're going to rise in this world, you do it based on merit. And merit can take a lot of different forms. It can take tons of different forms. But we rise up because we look at our situation, we survive better than everybody else. Human beings are kind of the top of the food chain in that regard because of our intellect, but that doesn't mean it'll always be so. And we need to remember that. That's very humbling to realize that you're finite. It's humbling to realize that your intelligence that allowed you to survive so long may not actually pull it off in the end. The dinosaurs were the biggest dogs in the shed at one point in time, until an asteroid came out and struck the Earth probably and destroyed them. We're facing some of our own challenges because of our own success. Our own successes led to our own problems. And we have to address those problems because that's what we're dealing with. I don't want to sound arrogant. I don't think atheism makes you arrogant. It makes you very humble because you realize this is it. This is what you have. No divine sugar daddy is going to pull you out of it. You have to go out and do it. You're not chosen. You're not special in that regard. If you're going to make yourself special, go out there and do some good things for humanity. Create a better world. Leave something for your children that will allow them, then it's up to them. But you'll know as you face death's final hurdle that you handed something to them that could make life a lot better for them. Do that instead. To me, that is a far better and more humbling thing than to believe you're some sort of chosen people following some first principle of God that somehow makes you superior to everybody else. And no matter how you slice it, no matter how much you claim humility, it's a pretty arrogant thing to say that you're the only one hearing from God and following God and everybody else is not. That is just plain, straight up arrogance and pride. And religion is abundant in it, which is why I'm an anti-theist. I think it needs to be opposed. I think in 100 years, if the human race as a whole says, that whole religion thing, that was just a bad trip. That's just a bad go. We just need to get rid of it. I would cheer that moment. I would absolutely cheer it because looking back at it, that's the biggest problem that I always had. That's it for today. I want to once again welcome you to my channel. Comments have a way of influencing and determining the content of Friday's videos, as you can see, and I will respond to them when I can. Videos generally upload Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Sometimes, depending on my work schedule, that can be different. One thing I won't tolerate is name calling. Demonstrate somebody's stupid or a fool. Don't call them that. If you think an idea is foolish, call the idea foolish, and then demonstrate it. Don't just call somebody a fool or an idiot or stupid. Um, be sure to like and subscribe and get your notifications the way you want. Thank you once again for coming by. And hopefully, I can someday convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, have a great day and goodbye.